Father Ethan Collins stood by the church window gazing out over the vast fields where the faint afternoon sunlight shimmered gently on the earth. This church had stood for more than a century, its solid stones bearing witness to countless generations of people. But to Ethan, the church seemed like an empty space devoid of true connection. Though he lived and worked here every day, the sense of solitude never left him. He was a young priest, newly appointed to this rural area a year ago. At 30, his days had passed quietly, uneventfully. He taught catechism, assisted the community, and led the services, but behind everything he did was the absence of something important. Something he couldn't quite identify, but it made him feel that his work lacked a deeper purpose. Today, like every day, Ethan stood at the altar reading the sacred verses. His eyes seemed to search to seek something within the lines of those words, but found nothing. He suddenly recalled a question his former parish priest had asked him when he was a young boy. "Where will you seek peace, Ethan?" That question seemed to resonate in his life now. But even now he had not found the answer. This feeling was not one of disappointment. It was more like something lingering within him, as if there were a hole in his soul that he couldn't fill. This church was beautiful and peaceful, but to Ethan, it felt like a silent space where everyone who came brought their own private sorrows. And today, by chance, he would meet someone whose story would change his life forever. That afternoon, Maria entered the church. She was a middle-aged woman, her hair touched with silver, and her skin wrinkled with the passage of time, but her eyes radiated resilience and a quiet pain that was not easily noticeable to others. Maria was not a regular churchgoer. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts, facing her past and the losses she had endured. When Ethan saw her from afar, her steady stride but sorrowful demeanor made him realize immediately that she was not just seeking simple comfort. She carried something heavy in her heart. Maria entered the church quietly, as if wanting to blend into the sacred space to find peace to reflect on all she had lost. She knelt before the altar, hands clasped together, her eyes half closed as if sinking into deep contemplation. Ethan watched from a hidden corner, but when his gaze accidentally met Maria's, he felt a strange rush of emotion pass through his body. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment he felt something calling to him. A connection he couldn't understand, a deep empathy stirring from somewhere within his heart. Then, in the deep silence of the church, Maria whispered her prayer, but not for herself. Her words came from a distant place within her soul. "Lord, if you can please bring my son back to me. I cannot live in his absence any longer." There was no sound, only Maria's breath, soft, like the wind echoing in the space. Ethan stood still, feeling each word of her prayer. It wasn't a typical plea. It wasn't a request for peace or healing for herself. It was a deep, aching yearning, a love that couldn't be eased. Her prayer carried a pain, as if it had been buried long ago, but still burned quietly in the heart of the mother. Ethan didn't understand why he felt each word of that prayer so clearly, as though it pierced through the layers of daily thoughts and straight into his heart. He could feel Maria's pain, her sense of being lost and alone in every breath, every word she uttered. A pause passed, as if time itself had stopped in that moment. Maria remained on her knees, unaware that someone was watching her, feeling her pain so deeply. Ethan felt a strong urge within him, a need to do something. He didn't know if it was a coincidence or a calling, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch Maria suffer alone. He had to do something, even though he didn't know how he could help her. Just then, Maria stood and turned, preparing to leave the church. Ethan hurried over and gently called out to her. "Maria, is there anything I can do for you?" Maria paused for a moment, as if surprised that someone had noticed her. She turned around, her eyes a bit bewildered, but quickly returned to a cold, distant expression, as if she didn't want to open up to anyone. But in the end, she answered, her voice soft, as if afraid of being overheard. "I don't know, I want to find my son. I lost him a long time ago, and I don't know how to keep living without him." Ethan felt a stir in his heart, as if something deep inside him had been awakened. He never imagined that such a simple encounter could change his life forever. "I will help you find your son," Ethan said, his voice firm, even though he didn't know where to begin. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't let Maria go through this journey alone. Maria looked at him for a long time, as if not believing what she had just heard. Finally, she nodded slightly, without saying anything more. She turned and walked away, but the hearts of both of them had already been changed from that moment. From that day on, Ethan and Maria's lives would never be the same. And it all began with a quiet prayer on that foggy afternoon, when a young priest and a grieving mother unknowingly met beneath the roof of this old church. Ethan could never forget that moment. The moment when Maria's eyes met his in the quiet stillness of the church. Her words, though gentle, had touched him deeply. Every time he thought about it, he felt a strong urging within him. His mind told him it wasn't his business, that he probably shouldn't get too involved in someone else's life, but his heart urged him to do the opposite. Since his meeting with Maria, everything seemed to change. In the days that followed, Maria never returned to the church. Ethan continued his daily work, but a strange unease lingered in his heart. Every morning when he entered the church, he would look out the door, hoping to see Maria again. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know where to begin. He had never done this kind of work before. Though he was a priest, it didn't mean he knew how to find a missing child. More than a week passed. One autumn afternoon, when the sunset cast its faint rays through the church's stained glass, Ethan sat by the altar praying. He wasn't praying for himself, but for Maria and all that she had lost. He didn't know why he felt this way, but his heart urged him to do something bigger, something he had never imagined would happen in his life. "Lord, please help me do something. I don't know if I am capable, but I will do my best." Ethan's prayer wasn't just a simple request. It was a call for faith in himself, even though he wasn't fully confident in his abilities. But the sense that Maria needed him drove him to find a solution, despite the hesitation and doubt rising within him. The next day, as Ethan was going about his usual tasks, a woman stood at the church door. It was Maria. She still carried her quiet, thoughtful demeanor, but her eyes today were different from the first time. Something had changed within her, as if a part of her was ready to face the challenges life had thrown her way. Maria looked at Ethan for a long time before speaking. "Father Ethan, I think I'm ready. I can't live in doubt and waiting any longer. If you can help me find my son, I will do whatever it takes." Ethan was surprised, but also felt a quiet joy rising within him. He didn't say anything immediately, but simply nodded, his gaze resolute. "I will do everything I can to help you. Where do we begin?" Maria took a deep breath and then pulled out a photo from her bag, faded with time. She handed it to Ethan, her eyes full of determination. "This is David, my son. He disappeared when he was 10 years old. We don't know where he went. I've never stopped searching, but now I need help." The photo in Ethan's hands seemed to hold a special power. The boy in the picture smiled brightly, his eyes sparkling with mischief and life. David looked so young, and even though the image had faded over the years, there was something striking about his face. "We'll start by gathering any information from David's past," Ethan said softly, yet with resolve. "It may not be easy, but we won't give up." Maria sat down, her head slightly, bowed, her hand resting on David's photo. It seemed like she was going through a wave of emotions. The years of searching had drained her strength and hope, but Ethan's gaze made her feel once again that maybe, just maybe, her son would return. "Father Ethan," Maria said, her voice deepening, "I don't know if I can wait any longer. I fear that if I continue living in his absence, I'll lose myself. I don't know how much longer I can endure." Ethan felt a heaviness in his heart. He knew this wasn't just a physical search, but an emotional journey as well. What Maria had gone through wasn't just a material loss. It was an indescribable pain on a spiritual level. He felt it deeply, and in that moment he promised himself that he wouldn't let Maria continue alone on this journey. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Ethan said, his heart full of sincerity. "We will do this together." After that conversation, a heavy but hopeful feeling filled Ethan's heart. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't give up. Not because it was his duty as a priest, but because his heart was urging him to do so. In the following days, Ethan began gathering information about David. He met with people in the community, asking for any clues about the missing boy. He contacted local authorities, revisiting old records of David's disappearance. But the deeper he went into the search, the more he felt that something was amiss. Past information began to surface, and dark secrets that Maria had kept hidden for many years began to rise. Ethan didn't know what he would face, but he was determined. His determination was not just to help Maria find her son, but to uncover the truth, even if it meant disrupting everything in his life. And once again, the church remained silent, but within Ethan it had become the place of resolve, the beginning of a challenging and revealing journey. It had been over 3 weeks since the first meeting between Ethan and Maria. During this time, Ethan had tirelessly worked to gather information about David, Maria's son. Every day he visited the police station, conversed with local residents, and never overlooked any lead, no matter how small. But the more he searched, the more he felt like he was walking through a labyrinth with no way out. The details about David became increasingly elusive, as though a thick veil of secrecy enveloped the boy's story. Questions swirled in Ethan's mind, with no clear answers. Why had Maria been unable to find her son after all these years? Why were there strange omissions in David's missing persons file? And most worrying of all, was he even on the right path? One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the church's stained glass windows, Ethan received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar. Sheriff Grant, whom Ethan had met during a prior information exchange about David's disappearance. "Father Collins, I need to see you. There's some new information about David's disappearance that I think you should know." Sheriff Grant's voice was serious. Ethan sensed the tension in his colleague's tone. He responded quickly, "I'll be right over. Thank you for reaching out." Sheriff Grant was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a penetrating gaze. He had been involved in the investigation of David's disappearance many years ago, but after a while the case seemed to have been abandoned, with no one continuing to pursue it. Nevertheless, he maintained some connections with Maria and her family. When Ethan arrived at the police station, Sheriff Grant greeted him in his office, where papers and files were piled high on the desk. Grant motioned for Ethan to sit and opened a file. "We've found some important information in the missing persons file. But I have to stress, what I'm about to tell you might complicate things further." Grant said, his gaze serious. "We'll get to the bottom of this, won't we?" Ethan asked, a sense of unease creeping into his chest. "I hope so," Grant sighed. "Actually, we've found some information related to Maria's family that we didn't know before. Some details that seem quite strange." Ethan looked at the file, which contained copies of reports from many years ago. Among the documents was evidence related to an incident that occurred before David went missing. According to the report, several months before David disappeared, Maria had been threatened by a mysterious man, someone who no one in the community could clearly identify. This man had repeatedly shown up at Maria's house in the evening, leaving suspicious traces behind. A man Ethan asked, feeling something was off. "That's right," Grant replied. "But the odd thing is, even though we've tried to gather information about him, we haven't been able to find any trace of him. And even stranger, after David went missing, this man suddenly disappeared. No one in the village or community knows who he is." Ethan stood frozen. This made him feel even more uneasy. Could this mysterious man be involved in David's disappearance? Why were there no other details about him? "I think I need to speak directly to Maria about this information," Ethan said. "I'm not sure if she knows any of this yet." Grant looked at him seriously. "Ethan, I don't want to scare her. She's been through too much already. But perhaps this information will help us solve the case." An hour later, Ethan found Maria sitting alone in her small home. The interior hadn't changed much since his last visit. The furniture was still in place, but Maria's eyes seemed dimmer, as though she were sinking into an abyss with no way out. Maria saw Ethan enter, not surprised, but as if she had been waiting for something. He sat down across from her, taking his time, trying to remain calm. "Maria," Ethan began, his voice gentle but firm. "I have some new information about David, and I think we need to talk about it." Maria didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the photo of David she always carried with her. She was silent for a long moment, before finally looking up at Ethan. "Has he come back, the man?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. Ethan was taken aback. He hadn't expected Maria to know about this man. "You know about him?" Ethan asked, his voice suddenly tense. Maria nodded, her gaze darkening, as if she were looking at a ghost from the past. "I can never forget that man. He came to my house many times before David disappeared. Every time I felt as if there were a shadow pressing down on our family." Maria paused, her eyes closing slightly, as if trying to confront the painful memories. "We never called the police because I was afraid it would harm David. But I knew I felt like something was very close, something I couldn't explain." Ethan stood frozen, his body tense. He didn't know who this man was, but it was clear he was involved in David's disappearance. The new details made everything even more mysterious and complicated. "Maria, I'm sorry to have to bring this up, but we need to delve into what happened before David went missing. We need to find out who this man is and what his connection is to David's disappearance." Maria raised her head, her eyes reflecting a strange resolve. She nodded, though the sorrow was still evident in her eyes. "I know this won't be easy, Ethan, but if it's the only way to find my son, I'll do anything." Ethan felt a surge of determination in Maria's words, and he knew this was a defining moment. Both of them stood at a crossroads, with no way of predicting what the outcome would be. With the new information they had uncovered, their journey would no longer be a simple search. But something deep within Ethan made him believe that no matter the challenges they would face, they would uncover the truth. Ethan looked at Maria, her eyes shining with an unresolved pain, but also a fierce strength, as if she had already prepared herself to face whatever lay ahead. He could feel Maria's burning desire not just to find David, but to uncover the truth behind the shadowy events surrounding his disappearance. Inside Ethan, a strong belief rose. They couldn't give up. They wouldn't stop until every clue had been followed, no matter how much it might change everything. "We need to learn everything we can about this man," Ethan said, his voice firm. He's definitely connected to David's disappearance. But to do that, we'll need to recover all the old data, every piece of information we overlooked before. I'll try to access the records we missed." Maria nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the old photo of David. In that moment, it seemed like all the memories of her son flooded back, making her look like a mother who had waited for years. Maria had lost so much hope, peace of mind, but never her love for her child. She had never given up. "Thank you, Father." Maria said, her voice soft, but filled with an unshakable determination. "If you help me find my son, I will be forever grateful. But I'm also afraid that the more we search, the deeper we'll sink into mysteries we can't unravel." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He sat quietly for a moment. Maria's words echoed in his mind. Were they walking down a road they could never turn back from? Would what they found shed light on everything, or just make things even more obscure? In the following days, Ethan and Maria continued gathering information, refusing to abandon any leads. Ethan, as a priest, reached out to charitable organizations, government agencies, and even local residents. But every time he thought he was close to finding a new lead, it slipped through his fingers. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his office reviewing the reports and records he had collected, he noticed a small but curious detail. One of the old missing persons reports about David contained a police file mentioning a man named Victor Ainsley, a name Ethan had never heard of before. Victor Ainsley, a new name but one that seemed somehow connected to the faint traces Ethan had encountered during his search. According to the report, Victor Ainsley was a stranger who appeared in the area around the time David went missing. However, there was no information about where he had come from or where he went afterward. Even stranger, right after David disappeared, Victor Ainsley also vanished without a trace. Ethan felt as though he had uncovered an important lead. It seemed like all these strange events were closely linked, and this might be the key to unlocking the mystery of David's disappearance. He decided he needed to learn more about Victor Ainsley. But how could he gather information about a man no one seemed to know? Ethan remembered his conversations with Sheriff Grant. He immediately called Grant and requested an urgent meeting. 2 hours later, Ethan met Grant at the police station. Grant was reviewing documents and reports about David's disappearance, his expression more tense than usual. "Father Collins." Grant began, his voice lower. "I've gone over all the files, and just as you suspected, Victor Ainsley is connected. But the problem is, we don't have much information about him. There's one important detail I discovered recently. Victor Ainsley wasn't a stranger to this area. He lived here when he was young, but after he grew up, he suddenly disappeared. No one knows why." Ethan sat still, trying to process more about this mysterious man. Everything was becoming more complicated. Did he have any connection to Maria's family? Grant shook his head. "I don't see any direct connection between Ainsley and her family. However, the reports I found show that he worked for a local company before disappearing. The company shut down shortly afterward without any clear reason. I suspect that Ainsley may have known something about Maria's family that we don't." Ethan sighed. He felt like the more he searched, the more he was being drawn into a carefully concealed trap. There were too many unclear details, and the pieces he was trying to put together were becoming more and more obscure. "We need to find more information about Ainsley." Ethan said, his voice determined. "I won't stop until I know who he really is and what he did." Grant looked at Ethan, his eyes briefly showing concern. "Ethan, I'll do everything I can, but I have to be honest with you. The deeper we go into this, the more we encounter things that are inexplicable. If you find something, be prepared for what may come." Ethan didn't respond right away. He knew he had to keep going. If these secrets were not uncovered, they would haunt Maria and him forever. And once he had started, he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. That evening, as Ethan returned to the church, he felt a heaviness in his heart. Each step seemed to bring him closer to a dark truth, and he couldn't know what would happen next. Maria had trusted him, and he couldn't let her down. But what worried him most was the price they would have to pay to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, Maria sat by the window, the dim light of the oil lamp reflecting on her face. She had waited so long, and she knew that whatever happened, she couldn't turn back. Both of them had entered a path from which there was no return, but they wouldn't stop until every secret hidden for so many years had been revealed. Ethan sat in his office where the old walls of the church created a quiet space untouched by the outside world. He gazed out the window where the pale afternoon light slowly spread, casting a glow over the grassy fields outside the churchyard. Everything within his view was peaceful, yet inside him, it felt as though a storm was quietly gathering, an uncontrollable storm. More than a month had passed since the search began, but Ethan still felt like he hadn't made much progress. The clues that he and Maria had uncovered only made things more complicated. The name Victor Ainsley haunted him. A mysterious man with no clear trace yet, an inexplicable connection to Maria's family, particularly to David's disappearance. The deeper he dug into the past, the more Ethan felt himself being drawn into a chaotic tangle that he couldn't understand. He placed his notebook down and looked up at the crucifix on the wall, where soft light filtered through. The prayers he had recited so many times over the past weeks now seemed unable to reach his heart. The prayers couldn't soothe the storms within him. With each passing day, he felt himself drifting further from what had once been his essence, a priest devoted to faith and inner peace. But now he wasn't sure of anything anymore. The feelings he was facing, fear, anxiety, confusion, were not things a priest should be experiencing. He didn't know whether his actions were right, whether seeking the truth would truly help Maria and David, or just bring more suffering to everyone involved. He began to wonder, is the truth always the best thing to find the next day? Ethan walked into the church, the place where he usually felt closest to God. But this time he didn't feel the peace he usually sought. His footsteps echoed through the vastness of the church, the sound hollow. Everything around him seemed foreign, even the sacred statues he had always cherished. When he reached the altar, he didn't kneel as usual. He simply stood there looking at the flickering candles. His eyes were drawn to the shadows that the candles couldn't reach. He felt loneliness rising within him, and in that moment, Ethan wondered if his life had any true meaning. Was he really on the right path? He remembered the words his former priest had told him when he first entered the seminary. Ethan, not everyone is chosen to walk the path of God, and when you choose, you must accept the great challenges that come with it. But the most important thing is that you always keep your faith, for it is the only strength you have. But now his faith seemed to waver. Ethan wondered whether his faith could help him face these challenges, whether the decisions he was making were right, or if he was just avoiding the reality before him. That evening, Ethan met Maria in a small cafe near the church. She looked at him with a determined gaze, but there was an undeniable sadness in the depths of her eyes. She had heard about the information that Ethan and Sheriff Grant had found about Victor Ainsley, and though she wanted to believe in the discoveries, she sensed something unsettling inside herself. Maria could feel the tension in Ethan's demeanor. "Father Ethan, I sense something is changing in you. Are you beginning to doubt yourself?" Maria asked, her voice soft but full of understanding. Ethan could no longer hide it. He looked at Maria, feeling as though the entire world was cornering him. Maria, I don't know anymore. The deeper I go into this search, the more I feel I'm not strong enough to face it all. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I've started to wonder if the truth, no matter how painful, is really something we need to uncover. Maria was silent for a moment, her eyes seeming to look straight through Ethan's thoughts. She had endured so much pain, so many disappointments, but she had never given up hope. No matter how painful the truth could be, she still wanted to know it to find David, her only son. Father Ethan. I know this is a great challenge for both of us, but I also believe that if we don't find the truth, we will never be able to heal the wounds in our souls. Facing the truth, no matter how difficult, is the only way we can move forward. Maria's words struck Ethan deeply. He could feel her strength, and suddenly he remembered why he decided to become a priest in the first place: to help those who suffer, to bring hope and peace to people like Maria. He recalled the confidence he once had when he believed that faith could overcome any challenge. After the conversation with Maria, Ethan still felt the weight of worry pressing on his heart. He returned to the church, but this time not to pray, but to think about everything that had happened and the decisions he would have to make in the future. He couldn't deny that the search had changed him. It had forced him to face himself, to confront limits he had never imagined. He had once been someone with strong faith, but now he felt like he was facing a shadow of himself. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk, the dim light of his desk lamp casting shadows on the papers and documents before him. Questions swirled through his mind. Do I have the strength to help Maria? Can I continue this path without losing myself? Can I protect Maria from the pain she will face when the truth is revealed? Ethan felt like he was standing at a crossroads in his life. He could continue to find the truth, or he could give up and accept the safety of a world without answers. But he knew that if he gave up, he would never forgive himself. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a decision in his heart. He wouldn't give up. He would continue the search not only for Maria, but for himself. He would have to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And most importantly, he would not let fear control his life. The journey to find David would continue, but this time Ethan would not only seek the truth about a missing child, he would seek the truth about himself, about faith, resilience, and the path he had chosen to follow. The next morning, Ethan left the church, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. Questions kept swirling around, piling on top of one another like heavy stones pressing down on his chest. Was he doing the right thing? Would seeking the truth really bring something good for Maria and her family? Or would it just force them to face a truth too painful to bear? He walked out aimlessly, just needing some quiet space, a place where the chaos of thoughts occupying his mind could subside. As he passed through the quiet streets of the small town, the simple scenes only made him feel more alone and lost. Everything was the same, but he couldn't feel the peace he once saw. His steps stopped before a small house where Maria lived. He had been there many times, but today his feeling was different. He wasn't just a priest coming to offer help, but someone searching for the truth, confronting a journey that wasn't just Maria's, but his own. When Maria opened the door, she looked at him with a questioning gaze. She had noticed the change in him, and she knew Ethan was struggling with something deep inside. She invited him in, but said nothing more. Her eyes were full of patience and hope. Maria understood that Ethan was going through an inner battle that only he could overcome. Ethan sat down, his eyes looking down at his hands. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to speak. This conversation couldn't drag on in silence. Maria, I can't deceive myself anymore. Ethan began, his voice gentle but heavy. I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by continuing this search." Maria looked at him, saying nothing. She just sat silently waiting for an explanation. "What I've discovered about Victor Ainsley, about the secrets in your family's past. I feel like I'm going too far. Is finding the truth really worth it? Maria, when everything is laid bare, can we bear it?" Ethan sighed, looking into Maria's eyes, which never left his. Maria didn't answer right away. She quietly stood up, walked to the window, and gazed out. After a while, she turned back to Ethan with an unwavering look. "Ethan, I understand your worry. I understand that everything we're doing might open wounds that we can't foresee. But I also know one thing. I can't live in this uncertainty, not knowing what happened to my son. I've devoted my entire life to David, and if the truth could bring him back, no matter how painful, I would accept it." Maria paused for a moment, then continued, her voice stronger than ever. "I can't live with this pain forever. I can't live with his absence. Ethan, I need the truth, no matter how harsh it may be." Ethan went silent. Maria's words were like a wake-up call, a push he couldn't ignore. He understood that Maria had been living with that pain for so long that she could say such powerful words. She didn't just want to find her son, she wanted to find herself, to regain a part of her life she had lost over the years. Ethan felt a rising tension in his chest. He understood that this journey wouldn't be easy. Sometimes the truth wasn't just a solution, but a wave that swept away everything that had once been stable. And he, a priest who had lived with faith for many years, now had to face questions about himself, about his own beliefs. That entire day, Ethan couldn't escape his thoughts. He returned to the church in the late afternoon, but didn't go inside. He stood at the door, looking into the vast space. This place had once been his spiritual home, but now everything felt distant. He didn't know if the prayers he had recited for so many years would still be strong enough to help him overcome the temptations and doubts in his heart. That night, as darkness fell, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark room, the light from the oil lamp illuminating the holy images. In the darkness, he began to think about the path he had chosen. He had sacrificed so much to pursue the path of the priesthood, and now he had to decide whether he could continue on that path or find another way. He remembered the early days when he entered the seminary, the dreams, the hopes for a life-serving God. He had believed that faith would guide him through every challenge, but now he felt like he was standing at a crossroads with no way out. He could continue as a priest, but that would mean abandoning everything he felt, abandoning the truth he had begun to seek. If he chose to search for the truth, he would have to face consequences that might change his entire life. At that moment, a sudden thought flashed through his mind. Was being a priest the only choice he had in life? Had he placed all his faith in God and forgotten that he too was a human being with his own desires and emotions? He could help others find their faith, but he couldn't find his own. Ethan stood up, walked outside, and passed through the church gate. He needed to go somewhere, to find a space to listen to his heart. As his footsteps left the church grounds, he felt something different. Perhaps the journey to find David was not just about searching for a missing child, but about finding himself. Finding faith, purpose, and the reason he had chosen this path in the first place. In the darkness of the night, Ethan began to walk a step more determined than before, even though he didn't know what he would face next. But one thing was certain: he would not give up on this search, for both Maria and David, and for himself. That day, Ethan felt as though he had crossed an important threshold in his journey. The inner struggles, the unanswered questions, and the conflicts about his faith had slowly become part of his life. But in the days that followed, as he began to understand that the search was not just Maria's, but his own. As well, he began to face new challenges that threatened not only his career as a priest, but also the values he had spent his life upholding. After his deep conversation with Maria, Ethan had decided to do everything he could to continue the search. He contacted Sheriff Grant requesting his help in tracking down information about Victor Ainsley, the man who seemed to have a deep connection to David's disappearance. However, this time their search would not be as simple as before. Everything had become more complicated and difficult. Grant agreed to help Ethan, but warned him, Ethan, "I've gone over all the information about Ainsley, and I have to tell you straight. We're stepping into an unknown territory. What we find may not be what we want to find." Ethan, though filled with anxiety, remained determined. "We can't stop. I won't stop." The next day, Grant took Ethan to an abandoned house on the outskirts of town where Ainsley had once lived. The house appeared to be empty, with wild grass growing around it, and no signs of anyone living there. The door was rotting, and the wood around the house was weathered, as if time had forgotten this place. "We found information about Ainsley here," Grant said, as they stood before the house. "But nothing is clear. It seems he left a long time ago." Ethan felt a slight chill. Unspoken sensations began to rise within him. He wondered if this was the last trace Ainsley had left, or if it was just a trap set for those searching for the truth. They stepped inside the house. Everything inside was old, with nothing of particular note except for dust piles and thick cobwebs. However, when Ethan entered the living room, his gaze stopped at a small table near the window. On the table was an old photo, faded with time, but the image within it was still very clear. It was a photo of Maria David and a man Ethan didn't recognize. "What is this?" Ethan whispered. Grant looked at the photo, then shook his head. "We've never seen this photo before. It seems Ainsley knew Maria and her family." This revelation confused Ethan. He stared at the photo, a strange feeling rising within him. The man in the photo was Ainsley. But what about the other truths, the connection between Ainsley and Maria? And why was this photo here in an abandoned house? A week later, Ethan's investigation led him to a small village where Ainsley had spent his last years before vanishing. The locals were rather tight-lipped, and no one would reveal any information about Ainsley. Ethan had to enlist Grant's help to approach those who might know something about this mysterious man. Then one of them, an elderly woman named Hazel, agreed to share her stories about Ainsley. "Victor Ainsley wasn't an ordinary man," Hazel said in a trembling voice. "He had strange relationships. I saw him meet with Maria a few times. They talked a lot, but they never spoke about what was really going on. Ever since I've known Maria, I've sensed that something was off about their relationship." Ethan felt the tension in Hazel's words. He decided to press further. "Can you tell me more about these meetings?" Hazel sat down, her eyes distant. "Maria never spoke about her past. But I remember one time Ainsley came to see her one evening. They talked for a long time. Afterward, Ainsley left, and a few days later, David disappeared." A long silence passed between them. Ethan felt that he had uncovered an important piece of the puzzle. Was Ainsley the one who caused Maria to endure the pain of losing her son? Was he behind all the strange events? Ethan couldn't solve all these questions by himself. He decided to return to Maria to share what he had discovered. He knew that this information would force Maria to confront pains that had never healed, but he couldn't keep the truth from her. When he met Maria, he didn't speak immediately, but just looked at her with a thoughtful gaze. Finally, he spoke. "Maria, I've found some things about Victor Ainsley. He may have met with your family several times, and he might be the one connected to David's disappearance." Maria didn't say anything, just silently looked at Ethan. She could feel that this was the decisive moment of their journey. She was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. "Maria," Ethan said, his voice choked, "Ainsley has a very deep connection to your family, but I can't be sure of his role in David's disappearance. I only know that the more we search, the more we find things that can't be explained. Are you ready to face all of this?" Maria looked into Ethan's eyes, then slowly nodded. "I'm ready. I can't live with these unanswered questions anymore. No matter how painful the truth is, I want to know." They sat in silence for a moment, as if they had crossed an important threshold in their journey. Seeking the truth was not just a physical act, but also a spiritual sacrifice, a readiness to confront things they never thought they'd face. Ethan and Maria decided to continue their journey to find David together. They couldn't stop even if the road ahead was filled with dangers and the unknown. But what they knew for sure was that only when they found the truth could healing begin. Their journey was no longer simple. They had surpassed their own limits and fears, and no matter what the truth was, they would not stop. Finding David and finding peace in their hearts was the only thing they could do. This search would not only reshape Maria's life, but also Ethan's. But now they no longer hesitated. They continued moving forward, even though the path ahead was full of challenges. In the days following the pivotal conversation between Ethan and Maria, they continued searching for clues about Victor Ainsley. They moved from one village to another, speaking to many people trying to trace the signs Ainsley had left in his journey. But despite their efforts, nothing was clear. The clues grew more and more faint, and the deeper they went into the truth, the more it felt like they were plunging into a maze with no way out. Ethan began to feel the tension slowly overtaking his mind. The long days without sleep, the sleepless nights spent studying documents and meeting witnesses were wearing him down. Not only that, the questions about faith, the doubts about himself and his mission kept swirling around in his head. Being a priest was no easy task, but he was shouldering an even greater responsibility, helping a mother find her son. Even though he knew this journey was something he had to do, he couldn't deny that he was facing limits he had never imagined. Maria, though still resolute, could not avoid fatigue. The endless pain she had carried never ceased, and this journey again brought up memories of David. The days when he was just a small, innocent child. She felt as though she was living in a never-ending nightmare where every hope was chased away by the dark, inexplicable secrets. One morning, as the first light of day streamed into the church, Ethan received a call from Grant. The sheriff's voice sounded very anxious, and unlike before, he didn't delay in sharing the news. "Father Collins, I just got an important piece of information. Someone who knew Ainsley came to visit us this morning. He says he knows some details about Ainsley's past and might help us find a clue about David." Ethan's heart raced. Finally, after so many days of searching in vain, they had a lead. Wasting no time, Ethan rushed to meet Grant at the police station. When he arrived, Grant was sitting at his desk with an elderly man, gray-haired and stern-faced, sitting across from him. The man seemed uncomfortable to see Ethan walk in, but he spoke. "I'm James Delaney," the man said, his voice heavy but his eyes revealing clear worry. "I worked with Ainsley many years ago, and I know he did things I'd rather not remember. Maybe you need to know this to understand him better." Ethan sat down, a feeling of suspense rising. This could be the key to unraveling the mysteries they were searching for. "Can you tell me about your relationship with Ainsley?" Ethan asked, trying to stay calm even though a storm was rising inside him. James Delaney sighed, his eyes drifting as if lost in painful memories. Ainsley wasn't someone I could call a friend, but I know he had a complicated relationship with Maria, her family, and I don't think what I'm about to tell you will be good for any of us. Ethan listened carefully, his eyes fixed on James, his hands clenched on the table. Victor Ainsley wasn't just the person we saw on the surface, James continued. He had a dark past relationships no one knew about. I can't speak fully about what I witnessed, but I know he was involved in a strange case with a child, a case that had been hidden for many years. Ethan stared at James, feeling like everything was slowly being revealed, but also like a fog was lifting, revealing things that had never been spoken of. Was that case related to David? Ethan couldn't hold back asking. James paused for a moment, then nodded. Maybe, but I can't say for sure. What I know is that Ainsley tried to hide some very important truths related to Maria and her son. That's why David disappeared. After that meeting, Ethan felt like everything was starting to become unclear. The biggest question now was if Ainsley was involved in David's disappearance, why would he hide the truth, and could this truth help them find David or make everything worse? Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Maria. Would she be strong enough to bear everything that was coming? Would she be able to stand firm when all the truths were revealed? He returned to the church late one evening, where he had once found so much solace. But this time everything felt different. He sat down by the altar, feeling exhaustion rising within him. This journey had been too long, and he wasn't sure if he could continue. He could feel the fatigue, but also a strong urge, a calling he couldn't resist. Ethan looked at the crucifix, and once again he asked himself, could he do this? Could he bear the price of uncovering the truth about David? Finally, he made a decision. He wouldn't give up. Even though the road was difficult and arduous, he would continue to the end. He couldn't stand by and watch Maria continue to live in pain, and he couldn't turn his back on the truth. No matter how painful the truth was, he wouldn't turn back. They would move forward not just to find David, but to heal the deep wounds in each of their hearts. Ethan stood up, walking out of the church. Tonight he wouldn't find sleep. But one thing was certain. This journey had surpassed the limits of fear and doubt. He would not stop until he had uncovered the whole truth. Ethan and Maria's journey to find David had stretched across many weeks with countless challenges, exhaustion, and moments of hope interspersed with deep disappointment. But everything seemed to be drawing near to a conclusion. Each step they took now was no longer simply the search for a missing child, but a journey toward facing the truth, accepting dark secrets, and leaving behind wounds that could never fully be erased. That day the rain fell lightly, its drops like the burdens that everyone carried within. Ethan sat in his office looking out through the church window. He hadn't slept for 3 nights. The new information about Ainsley, the complex relationships between him and Maria's family, the painful discoveries from their past, everything had made Ethan feel that he was close to something monumental yet terrifying. He couldn't stop thinking about Maria. She had endured so much, living in the pain of losing her son for so many years. And now, as the truth was nearly revealed, would she be able to face everything that was coming? Maria came to see Ethan that afternoon. She didn't say much, simply sat down by the table, her eyes quiet but her hands trembling. Ethan could feel the anxiety in every movement she made, though she tried to maintain her strength. How many years had she lived in longing and pain? How many times had she been denied hope? But now, as the truth drew near, Maria felt uncertainty. Father Ethan. Maria spoke softly, yet with determination. I am ready to face everything, but I can't help but feel afraid. Will I be able to endure it? When I learn the truth, will I be able to live with it? Ethan looked into Maria's eyes. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine. They had embarked on a journey with no turning back. But the truth, painful as it was the only thing that could free them from the shadows that weighed so heavily. Maria, we can't live forever in the unknown. Yes. The truth may hurt, but it is the only way we can heal, Ethan said, his voice firm but full of compassion. Maria nodded, but the worry still showed on her face. They had come too far. There was no turning back now. But Maria knew she could no longer live in vain, waiting for something that might never come. After their conversation, Ethan felt his heart grow heavy. They were ready to face the truth. However, he knew that facing it would not be easy. David, the boy Maria had lost, was no longer the innocent 7-year-old child. He was a grown man, someone who had lived his life, and perhaps that life was no longer what Maria and Ethan had hoped for. They had found where David had been living, but when they met him, everything was different than they had imagined. David hadn't lived in an easy circumstance. He couldn't remember clearly what happened when he was kidnapped, but he had always felt that something was wrong since he was very young. His disappearance wasn't an accident. It was part of a plan that had been set up long before. When they met David, he wasn't surprised to see them. It was as though he had known he would meet his mother again one day. His gaze was both cold and filled with deep, hidden hurt. He had lived in confusion and uncertainty for years, and what he knew about the past were just incomplete fragments. The story of Ainsley and the secrets he had concealed slowly began to unfold. David talked about the years he was kidnapped, the days he spent in loneliness and pain, about the mysterious man who had taken him from his family without explanation. David's memories were incomplete, but each piece he recalled formed a terrifying picture, one that Maria had never wanted to see. We lost contact long ago, David said, his voice deep with sorrow. But I always thought that something was wrong with what happened. I can't remember much about my father, but I remember my mother, I remember my family. Maria couldn't hold back her emotions anymore. She rushed to embrace David. The years of pain seemed to be soothed in an instant by a mother's hug, though only for a fleeting moment. Ethan stepped back and observed the reunion. He felt a quiet peace within himself, but he couldn't deny that this search had changed all of them. Everyone, David, Maria, and even himself, had faced the harsh truth, and the price of that truth was immeasurable. After the emotional meeting, David, Maria, and Ethan spent time talking, explaining to each other what had happened. They not only rediscovered long-buried memories, but also confronted the wounds that had made them suffer for years. Maria couldn't forgive Ainsley immediately, but she began to understand that everything that had happened in the past was not her fault. She had loved her son with all her heart, and it was only because of Ainsley's cruelty that they had endured so many years of suffering. David also began to realize that his disappearance hadn't been a random event. He had lived in secrecy and darkness for so many years, and now he had to face what he had forgotten. He couldn't change the past, but he could find a way to heal the wounds and move forward. Their reunion wasn't an end, but a new beginning. Together, they learned how to forgive not just others, but also themselves. Maria couldn't go back in time, but she could live on with her son, with the hope that all the pain would gradually be soothed. A month after the first meeting between Maria, David, and Ethan, things seemed to have settled down. Maria and David had begun to rebuild their mother-son relationship. Though the wounds weren't fully healed, they had found comfort in one another. Ethan continued his work at the church, but he now viewed life and his mission differently. He no longer felt uncertainty or doubt about his decision. He had found peace within himself, not because he had completed the search, but because he had found an important part of himself. He understood that sometimes healing doesn't come from seeking perfection, but from accepting the imperfections and pains in life. As Ethan stood before the altar in the church one morning, sunlight streaming through the stained glass window, he felt a profound peace within. The journey had ended, but the journey of healing continued, and he knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead, he would never give up. 1 year after the emotional reunion between Maria and David, their lives had gradually returned to a state of peace. The wounds in their hearts, once a persistent pain, had begun to heal, though not completely. But this newfound peace did not come from forgetting the past. It came from acceptance and forgiveness. And in this journey, reconciliation not only between Maria and David, but also between Ethan and himself, brought profound changes in each of their hearts. Maria had opened her heart not only to David, but also to herself. Her relationship with her son was gradually being rebuilt, not as the sweet reunion she had once imagined, but as a process of learning and patience. David was no longer the boy she had lost. Now he was a young man with his own thoughts, pains, and memories. Yet Maria no longer tried to force him to return to the image of his childhood. She loved him as an adult, and for David, that was enough. David had also changed. He was no longer a person with amnesia living in confusion and suffering. He had begun to become more aware of himself, of the events from the past that he could not change. The memories that Ainsley had stolen were slowly returning to him, and with them came questions he had to face. However, for the first time in many years, he no longer felt a sense of desperate loneliness. Maria and Ethan had helped him realize that although he couldn't change the past, he could change the way he viewed it. For Maria, every new day was an opportunity to start again. She had learned not to live in regret or sorrow over the past, but instead to live for the present moments where she could be with her son and build a new future. For Ethan, this journey was not just about searching for David or helping Maria. It was a search for himself. When he looked back, he realized that he had not only changed in the past months, but he had found a new way of living. No longer a priest who was distant from himself, Ethan had begun to understand his mission more clearly. He had realized that reconciliation was not just about helping others overcome suffering, but also about facing the shadows within his own heart. His encounters with Maria and David had helped him understand that to help others find peace, one must first find peace within their own heart. He no longer felt bound by questions about his mission or purpose. He had found purpose in the simple things, loving and caring for those around him, whether they were suffering or not. Maria and David, though they never spoke of it, also understood this from Ethan. They saw the change in him and knew that Ethan's peace was part of their own healing process. Ethan was no longer the figure standing on a high pedestal, leading others with theory or vague beliefs. He had become part of this journey, not a distant observer, but a friend, a companion, someone who had learned to live and love in the most sincere way. On a late autumn day when the sky was clear and a gentle wind blew through the fields, Maria, David, and Ethan walked into the church where their journey had begun. They had decided to hold a ceremony not to celebrate David's return, but to honor the reconciliation they had found. It was not a grand ceremony with complex rituals, but a simple, warm service where each of them could feel the peace in their hearts. Ethan stood before the altar, with Maria and David by his side. He looked at the two of them, then up at the crucifix. Soft light from the windows illuminated them, as if God were looking down on them, witnessing this important moment. It was a moment in which they not only found forgiveness, but also a deep understanding of love and loss. "We've been through so much," Ethan began, his voice warm yet firm. "The pain cannot be easily erased, but love and forgiveness are the things that can heal all wounds. Today we are not just a family reunited, but people who have learned to accept the truth and walk in peace." Maria turned to look at David, her gaze warm and filled with love. She didn't need to say anything more, as all her feelings were expressed in that look. David, the one who had lost everything, now felt that he was no longer alone. He felt the love of his mother, of Ethan, and that was enough for him to continue living with hope. The ceremony ended in silence, with no applause, but it was filled with tears. Tears of release, of pain being soothed, of wounds beginning to heal. From that day on, their lives moved into a new chapter. Maria and David had rekindled their bond after many years of separation. David had slowly found his way, though the path was still full of hardships and challenges. But at least he knew that he no longer had to live in the shadows of the past. He had learned how to love again, starting with his own family. Maria, though she would never forget the years of suffering, had learned how to live with those memories. She no longer let them dominate her life, but used them to nurture her love for her son. She had found peace within herself, and no matter how difficult the road ahead was, she was ready to face it. As for Ethan, he continued his work as a priest, but he no longer viewed life through a lens of just faith or doctrines. He had understood that love and forgiveness were the greatest values, and that was how he could continue helping those who needed him. Looking back at all that had happened, they no longer felt the pain of loss or absence. They had found reconciliation within themselves and in each other's lives. And though the future still held many unknowns, they knew that as long as they were together, they would have the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead.